Okay.
Who here has been married at least 50 years or more? Whoa. Okay,
Wow.
good. Who has been married at least 25 years? Okay. And who's been married 10 years or less? So maybe it's a second marriage or you're just a youngster. Patrick, you're the newlywed in the group. Open Vincent. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Everyone, thank you everyone for joining us today. You're in for a real treat here. I'm going to toss it over to Mary, and I'm going to go ahead and mute myself.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you, Patrick. And I have to say, by just a little introduction, I don't really remember when Patrick and I met. I think it's been about 10 years ago or more. And but I think what happened is that what often happens, like-minded people sort of find each other, and so we found each other. And here's what I'll tell you. Well, here's what, when I think of Patrick, I always think of, first of all, those beautiful, he always has beautiful scenery behind his videos. It used to make me jealous. It was always this beautiful scenery. Um, and what we share is a passion for working with people with Parkinson's. And the other thing I think we share is an understanding through our own experience that one of the best tools that can help people with PD stay the course is group exercise, group practice, and also programs that he's developed, that I've developed, that can help you practice on your own after you've done any kind of formal therapy, because therapy is short-lived. 30 days of therapy if you don't have some tools or a support system to help you stay the course. We have talked for quite a long time about doing a video together where we couple voice practice with maybe exercise or activities of daily living, because voice aerobics, that's what it is. It's voice practice coupled with movement. So maybe you can encourage us to get that done. So I'm a speech language pathologist, and I live in Florida, which I think Patrick already said. And back in 1999, when I was already seeing patients with Parkinson's, I realized that there was really nothing available once they finished therapy. And so that's when I created voice aerobics as a class. And then in 2008, I recorded a class on DVD because people were always asking me for the exercises, and made it available for distribution. In 2009, I left a hospital position where I had been to go into private practice, and my private practice is also called Voice Aerobics, and it's located in Southwest Florida in Punta Gorda. Back in around 1999, when I had created the DVD, my dad, who lived in Ohio, was diagnosed with Parkinson's or Parkinsonism, and his physical health was declining. And if you think back to where we all were, if we can think back that far, in 23 years ago, I guess, we didn't have internet. We really, the only way you shared information was what you got from your physician. And even though I feel at that time I already knew a lot about Parkinson's, I know so much more. We know so much more about Parkinson's now. And when I think back, it makes me a little sad because while I may not have changed the trajectory of my dad's disease, I may have been able to help my parents and my family deal better with the changes that were occurring. And so what I'm going to share with you today is, I think, some of what I've learned over the last 33 years in my practice in Florida of working with lots and lots of couples. In fact, I was kind of thinking about it. I guess I have had hundreds of couples in my office over the years. Because usually when somebody has a communication problem, regardless of what the reason is, it could be a stroke, it could be after an illness or Parkinson's or a related diagnosis. If they're married, Usually their spouse joins them, at least for that first assessment. And they walk in with their 50 years or their 30 years or their 25 years of a marriage and a dynamic of how they interact and how they communicate. And that's still there. And the only difference now is that Parkinson's has entered into it, for better or for worse. So our focus today, usually when I do a presentation, because I'm a speech pathologist, I'm usually talking about speech or voice or swallowing. And although I'll reference that today, what I hope we're going to think about today is a much bigger, broader look of communication and how some of the changes, some of the motor speech changes in Parkinson's can affect your relationships and how you communicate in those important relationships. All right. So I'm going to be focusing on interpersonal relationships or communication rather. And so we're usually talking about communication with a significant partner, a spouse. Maybe if you live with an adult child or they live with you, and that's the primary person that you communicate with. It can also include family communication within social gatherings with friends. So beyond sort of the language that we use, or verbal and nonverbal, research in interpersonal communication is also very interested in how it affects our relationships and kind of the emotional components of our relationships. So before we kind of get into it, I like to say these are kind of the ground rules. And so the first thing I'm going to say, if you're someone here this afternoon who has a diagnosis of Parkinson's, is just to maybe remind you that you did not invite Parkinson's into your life or into your marriage. It kind of showed up like a relative that you didn't really want to see, or maybe a problem child, and now has moved in with you, and they're with you. You're stuck with it. Parkinson's is causing your motor speech symptoms. It's not your fault. And I say that because sometimes people will perform one way in therapy, and then they get in the car on the drive home, and their spouse will say, well, now they're back to mumbling, or, well, Mary, they do it for you, but they don't do it at home. It's not because you're doing something on purpose. It's because you have a motor speech symptom that can be challenging and difficult to always manage. No shame. And, therapy is sort of interesting. When you come to me or you go to a therapist, part of our job is to ask what bothers you, but then it's also to kind of probe to identify sort of what the problem is. And so oftentimes in therapy, speech, physical therapy, we're focusing a lot on problems and the problems. But really, what I also hope to do, and really from the first time I meet somebody, is to focus on the outcome. What are you hoping to get from therapy that you're doing? And really try to stay focused on that positive outcome. Because I hope that nobody ever leaves my office feeling worse about themselves than when they came in. And I hope that none of you go to bed at night feeling worse about yourself because of this diagnosis of a chronic disease we call Parkinson's. It's not your fault. Now, this last one is a real pet peeve of mine. I hate nothing more than when I've been at a conference and I hear the conference organizers say, all right, so all the patients will go to this room and the caregivers will go to this room. In my office, in the hospital, in a doctor's office, you are a patient. That's the role we'll assign you. But at home, you are not a patient. And your spouse is not a caregiver. Paul Short is a neuropsychologist who did a podcast with me a few years ago, and he really drove this point to home. Caregivers are paid employees. They're CNAs. They're nurses. Your spouse may help you with some physical things. When my mom needed help in the last year of her life. I certainly helped her with a lot of things, but I never thought of myself as a nurse or her CNA. I was her daughter. So the words we use, I think, really matter. You are a husband, you are a wife, you are a father, a brother, despite the fact that you have Parkinson's. And if you're a spouse, you're a care partner, you're a wife or a husband. And then the other thing I'm just going to tag on to that is this. I would say at least once a week, I'm having a conversation with somebody in my office. If it's the person with Parkinson's, I'm having a conversation about what would you do if your wife or husband gets sick? What if they have to go to the hospital for shoulder surgery? What if they get sick with the flu and they're in bed for a few days? Are you going to be able to make phone calls? Is your speech clear enough, voice strong enough that you can call and make appointments, that you can call the pharmacy? Are you organized enough that you're going to be able to manage that schedule? I have some patients with PD whose spouses are the ones that have a lot of physical problems. And so their spouse is actually dependent on them. And I'll say, ask my patient, what happens if you fall and get injured and now have to go to rehab for several weeks? Do you have a plan? And I'm always stunned at how many times people say, well, I don't know, not really. So I happen to have an office right next door to mine, which is a sort of an a la carte home care business, and where you can hire somebody for a minimum of 3 hours a day to come in and do errands for you, to prepare meals. It's not nursing, it's all that home health. And I always encourage my patients to go to a couple of those agencies. I know it's not cheap, but most people can afford 3 hours a day. Hire one of them. Get used to having somebody come into your home. Get used to hiring someone to help you so that maybe your spouse can go out to the gym, can go get a massage, can go shopping, so that if something happens, you got a plan, because you got to have a plan. And frankly, that's true whether you have Parkinson's or not. That's just true for all of us, particularly as we're aging. So beyond the aspect of communication that is what we consider sort of transactional or pragmatic, meaning the message, give me something, do something, giving instructions, communication also has an element that really is our vehicle for emotional connection and intimacy. So that's really important to one, know that again, how you as a couple have been communicating for all those years you've been together and been married is how you communicate, for better or for worse. But some of the changes that come about from Parkinson's that affect your speech in a very literal way, or aspects of communication in a very literal way, are also going to impact how you've been communicating for many years. And sometimes the ways you've been communicating just aren't going to work anymore. And so if you're the person with PD, while we may be addressing some of the things that are challenging you, your partner may also have to do a little introspection and change some of the ways they're interacting and communicating with you as well. And I should say here that there is very, very little in the literature, meaning published literature, that really sort of discusses this aspect of communication in Parkinson's. There's a lot of information now about speech and voice changes and swallowing issues, but not a lot about these relational things. And so the little bit of literature that there is actually in my field has come out of the aphasia literature. And a lot of people now have heard that word over the last few weeks when Bruce Willis announced, or his family announced, that he had aphasia. So aphasia is a language problem. It's difficulty understanding or using speech or language. It usually follows some type of brain injury, probably stroke being the most common, and or sometimes it's a it's a problem in and of itself that actually is a progressive degenerative disease where people are losing language. But you could imagine if after a stroke, and you may have even known somebody who has aphasia from a stroke, it happens really quite suddenly. And people will make varying degrees of recovery, but for some people, it can be a very significant chronic problem for the remainder of their lives that will have a tremendous impact, not only for them, their ability or inability to communicate as they did before, but on their spouse who now may have to really carry the burden of being the primary communication partner in the relationship. Now, fortunately, Parkinson's does not usually affect communication to that degree, but nevertheless, any changes are going to have some impact on that relationship. So when I do a presentation in person, I usually ask at the beginning, if you're someone here, if you're a spouse of someone with Parkinson's, who thinks their spouse mumbles? And all the hands go up. And then I say, okay, if you're here, someone here with PD, who thinks your spouse doesn't hear? And all the hands go up. So, like I said, I've had hundreds of people in my office over 33 years, and I would say that both are possibly true. I don't try to argue facts, but both are important. So we know, or we pretty much understand, that with Parkinson's, there are motor speech changes that come about. And that can be changes in clarity. That can be changes in volume. Hypo means low volume. There can be rate disturbances. Speech can get too fast, can speed up. And then prosody of speech. And that's really a big one. And again, it's probably an aspect of speech production that doesn't always get a lot of attention. Prosody is the emotional flow, the expression. It's what makes our speech interesting, but it's also important because it conveys meaning. It's the difference between me saying, oh, nice job, Patrick, why don't you try that again? Or, nice job, Patrick, why don't you try that again? The exact same words came out of my mouth, but I think most of you would know that the second time I said it, it was not with sarcasm. I was actually praising some performance. So that expressional flow, the rise and fall of inflection is really important for messaging. And it can often be affected in Parkinson's because voice can get hypophonic, very low, very flat. And so now pretty soon your wife is asking you, well, where do you want to go out to dinner? I don't care, you pick it wherever you want to go. And maybe you actually are excited about going out to dinner, but your voice is going to convey a very different message to your listener. Now, again, a big pet peeve of mine, hearing loss. From time to time, I'll be working with a patient whose spouse has an obvious hearing loss. I can tell that just as I'm interacting with them. And when I bring it up, they acknowledge that, yeah, their hearing probably is bad, or that they have hearing aids, but they don't like them, so they don't wear them. So I think, and often say, because I'm pretty upfront with people, what is the point of the person with PD engaging in some intensive therapy program to try to improve volume and clarity of speech if their spouse refuses to wear their hearing aids? And conversely, I can say, I have patients from time to time, and when I turn my back to get something off my desk and I'm talking to them and they don't hear me, I ask, well, how's your hearing? And recently I had a guy say, oh, I wear hearing aids and I can't even see them when people have them. And I go, oh, do you have them in? And he goes, yeah, they're in my pocket. In your pocket? So there is now, again, a pretty robust body of literature, growing actually, that discusses the relationship between hearing loss and dementia. And while it may not be a direct causal relationship, there is a strong association because when the auditory cortex of your brain is not getting good information, it begins to shrink, just like muscles that don't get exercise. And if we know that there's a strong association of dementia with Parkinson's, why in heaven's name would you want to have another variable that's going to increase that potential? And the other thing, if you're driving and you're going from one town to another and you start losing the station you were listening to, and so now you're starting to get static, and it's hard to listen to that for very long. You're having to work harder to understand that signal, to process it. And if your hearing is not good and you're working harder to process the information, and on top of that, you're also working harder to process information because you maybe are processing it slower because of Parkinson's, you're really putting a lot of demands on your brain, a lot of extra cognitive work that really isn't necessary. So, bottom line, if you need to have your hearing checked, go to an audiologist and have it checked. At home, talk to each other in the same room. Don't talk to each other across the room. Face to face when you're having important conversations, for sure. Mute the TV. Don't try to talk over the background noise of the TV. And if you go to a friend's house for just social get together and the TV is on in the background and that makes it difficult for you to communicate either using your voice or hearing, ask them to lower the TV or even turn it off. And don't have important discussions in the car. It's just a really difficult environment. There's ambient noise. It's not a good place to try to have conversation. And the person that's driving needs to be paying attention. And it's a great place to practice if you're a passenger in the car. Some of you may have seen my high volt light, and you'll see it in a slide a little bit later. So that's a voice activated feedback tool that I use a lot in therapy. That's great to have with you in the car. Read road signs. Talk out loud in the car. You can do 20 minutes of practice just going from point A to point B. So sometimes a husband says, she's talking too softly, Mary, I can never understand her. And his wife, who has Parkinson's and hypophonia, low volume, says, I can't talk like this all the time. I feel like I'm shouting. Sound familiar? So we think the best we can understand motor speech changes, that one of the things that's happening, or one of the problems for the person with Parkinson's, is that there's a sensory perceptual disconnect that's causing the person with Parkinson's to misjudge the loudness of their voice, the amplitude of their voice, just like they may be misjudging the amplitude of their movements. And so when we ask them to increase volume to get to a more normal level of loudness, what do they tell me? This doesn't feel normal. And I'll give you an example that I have, a personal example very recently. So I took my car, I drive a little Fiat, to have new tires put on it in an alignment. And when I left the tire place, my car just didn't feel right. It just didn't feel right. Didn't feel normal. And I know that if I would have driven back to the tire place and said, this doesn't feel normal, they would have hooked my car up to some fancy computer system and they would have said, oh yeah, Mary, the alignment's perfect. But I had probably been driving it for a long enough time with the wheels out of alignment that now when they were back in alignment, it didn't feel normal. Because when we're trying to create new motor patterns for a while, it's not going to feel normal. I also think the reason that new motor pattern we're trying to create doesn't feel normal is because, like everything with Parkinson's, it's a sneaky disease. The changes are subtle and they're insidious. And we know that changes in speech actually are some of the prodromal symptoms, meaning some of the changes at a sensory motor level are happening even before you're having motor symptoms. So you're just sort of adapting to them in the same way that I was adapting to my cars being out of alignment. It began to feel normal after a while. Abnormal felt normal. So in therapy, we are often focusing, and I'm sure with Patrick, he's always focusing on increasing the amplitude of the movement. It may not feel normal to you as you begin doing it. But as I say to people, that's good. We're trying to get a new normal. The other thing that I have to be very considerate of, and you have to also be aware of, and your spouse has to be aware of, are medication off times. The more that you recognize what those are, recognize how you may be feeling when medicine has really kicked in or when you're wearing off is really important, because relaying that information to your physician is important. But I'm seeing people for 60 minutes in my office several times a week. So I'm going to also be able to observe that. I'm also going to be able to report that in my treatment notes and send that to the physician, because the physicians often are only with you for 15 minutes at a time. So they're either very reliant on what you're telling them or what they observe in that short office visit. Same with dyskinesias. I sometimes see people who have significant dyskinesia. It might be in their trunk muscles. They may have movement in their jaw or mandibular dyskinesia, all that squiggly movement. How can I imagine that they're going to have the ability to generate normal speech production when they've got all that extraneous movement being superimposed on the respiratory muscles, on the oral mandibular muscles? So again, I can note that in my notes. I can see if there's variability. It was very present on Monday, but it wasn't there at all on Wednesday. I can ask you about medications and the timing of your medications and report that to your physician. But again, I think what's important for you to recognize is that all of those fluctuations are also going to affect speech production and how you use your voice. None of us feels like talking when we're very, very tired, and our voices will reflect that, right? If somebody left a voicemail message for you when you got home, one of your children, for example, and they said, Mom, call me. Just that. Just that in their tone of voice, you would know or wonder what's wrong. Is something wrong? Because our voices always are telling on us. They're always telling about our emotional state, about our health. So again, just things for you to keep in mind. If you're a person with PD, something for your spouse to be aware of, because they can also help in observing some of those things and reporting some of those symptoms to your physician, because that's going to help your physician better manage your medications uh, to control your motor symptoms. So again, in my office, you're a spouse, you observe treatment. Wow, he sounds good, voice sounds pretty normal, and then gets in the car and talking like this again. Or gets home and is back to what you perceive as mumbling or not talking loud enough. Again, likely not doing it on purpose. I mean, after all, if you think about it, you've been talking all your life. And it's likely that nobody had to tell you to modulate your volume when you went into a movie theater or you went into church or you went into a restaurant where it was noisy and you had to get louder. You just did it because your brain was working properly, the feedback mechanism was working properly, and it was making those adjustments. But what I think is one of the saddest things is when you begin to be like the parrot on the right and you have left just not to talk anymore because it's just too much to think about and too hard to do. Because not only does it keep you out of the social milieu, but it begins to make your partner, your communication partners, whether that's your spouse or other family members, they're going to begin to feel lonely and miss that emotional connection that communication really creates in a relationship. So what can you do if fatigue is a real issue and is affecting your voice use? Well, you can rest before a social gathering, or maybe you warm up your voice before you go out for the evening to get together with friends. If you think about what runners do before they run, they warm up, they stretch, they warm up the body. And so maybe doing some vocal warm-ups would be really helpful before you're going to go out and use your voice more than usual. Or maybe you use a personal voice amplifier, a little amplifier that hooks on your belt loop with a microphone that comes across. I think that as speech language pathologists, we sometimes don't recommend that type of an assistive device enough, and yet physical therapy wouldn't hesitate to recommend a cane or a walker when you were going a long distance. So sometimes popping on a voice amplifier for those times when you're fatigued, but you really want to participate in the conversation can be really beneficial. Why did that pop up? I must have hit something. I don't know why that little pop-up is there. So oftentimes a spouse will also ask me, what can I do to help? Well, what I would probably say not to do, because you've probably been doing it and it hasn't helped, is nagging, right? You know, I always used to say nagging is not a good therapy technique. And yet, what did I do when I would talk to my dad, who lived in Ohio? Dad, talk louder. I can't hear you. Why are you mumbling? Dad, swallow. You're drooling. I nagged. It's what happens because we love the person and we so desperately want them to be who they've always been. But nagging really doesn't work. And in fact, I think it probably ends up way back when I said about shame, just makes you feel worse about yourself because you can't do what's being asked of you. But what you can do if you're a spouse, if you're an adult child, your parent has Parkinson's, let them know when they sound good. Remember, there's a little bit of a disconnect. They're not maybe making that judgment. But if you tell them, wow, you sound really good today. Your voice sounds so strong, it sounds so healthy, you sound like your old self. That's the kind of feedback that's really going to be helpful. I mentioned that most people with Parkinson's respond to external cueing. That can be a sound level meter. In the picture on the right, you see somebody using a high volt light that I mentioned. So that's a voice activated light that you can use when you're practicing, so that you practice at a high enough level of effort that you do get a strengthening effect, so that when you're using your voice conversationally, you feel what it takes to be able to maintain and sustain a loud enough and a clear enough voice for everyday conversation. So again, from time to time, someone says to me, a wife says, Mary, he won't exercise. He hates to exercise. Or a patient says to me, I hate to exercise. Well, I appreciate their honesty. I appreciate them telling me that. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to provide them with any exercise, but I'm going to be probably very selective. I'm going to really try to prioritize what I think they're going to is going to best address the problem or problems that they're having and that I think that they're going to do and adhere to. But you know, Patrick knows because he's an exercise specialist. Adhering, sticking with an exercise program is difficult for all of us, right? Just like sticking to a diet is hard. We're talking about behavioral changes, and they're really hard to kind of do over the long haul. I think the most important thing is creating the habit, whether that's going to a class, whether that's doing some exercise at home every day or an online exercise, but just creating that habit and sticking with it. And we're going to do in a little bit what I consider sort of core exercises that for voice are probably the most important to be doing forever. When I'm seeing someone for the first time, I think one of the most important things I have to try to tease out in that visit is, what are you willing and able to do? Willing to do, again, what's your level of interest? If you came to see me because your doctor gave you a prescription, you don't even know why you're there and don't think you need it, or your wife or your husband is annoyed and they're the ones that brought you to therapy, but you're not really sure why you're there. Or I call you to schedule an appointment because I got a referral, and you say to me on the phone, Mary, I don't really think my speech is that bad yet. And I'll ask, well, I'm just curious, what symptom are you waiting for? How will you know when your speech is actually bad enough? Because if you're waiting for symptoms, you're going to be behind the eight ball. You're having symptoms, right? But if you have some cognitive problems, if you have some Lewy body dementia, then we need to take that into consideration. Maybe I'm going to video record you doing some exercise. We can put it on your computer at home. So the only thing your spouse has to do is just maybe turn on the computer, and then they can go off and do other things while you follow along with me and you on a video doing your exercise. So again, it has to be really tailored to what your needs are, but what your abilities are, what you're going to be able to do. And if there's any positive that's come out of the pandemic, it is that there are so many online programs now for everything. And so there's really, you can't say, well, I don't live near a gym, because there's really many opportunities to do online exercise. And the great thing with that for all of us is all you got to do is show up. Uh, Early on in the presentation, there was a picture of a couple, and that's a patient of mine, someone who first came to see me back in 2015, and who's been a faithful member of a weekly class that I do since that time. But he and his wife go at least 3 times a week to the gym together, and they take classes together. They do a yoga class together. They do an aerobics class together. Maybe you turn on some music and dance around the living room. Talk about a great way to connect emotionally, but also to get some exercise together. And then the final thing I would say is that if somebody appears not to be motivated, it may be that it's really reflecting an underlying depression or apathy. Parkinson's is, after all, a disease that's in the brain, right? It's a brain disease. And so depression can be organic. It can be, again, a symptom of the disease, not just situational, oh, I feel bad today. And apathy, while it can look similar, is different, and that it even more so is just an absence of that drive, that get up and go that makes any of us get up in the morning and do something uh, with purpose, something that we like to do. So again, really important to discuss those things with your physician, because there may be medication that can be beneficial, because you don't want to assume, I certainly don't want to assume that the problem is just that, oh, the person isn't motivated. Maybe we just haven't given them the right motivation yet. So you're probably sick of me talking. So I'm going to stop sharing here for a minute, and let's come back to the full screen. Hi, everyone. All right. So does everybody know how to unmute themselves? You can unmute yourselves.
Yep.
Okay, great. So this is going to be a little noisy, but don't worry about that. And don't worry, I'll take any of your comments or questions before we're done this afternoon, okay? So we're going to do, there are 2 core vocal exercises that constitute, probably they're a part of all therapy programs, I would say, that have been designed to address motor speech problems in Parkinson's. But they're the exercise I always suggest to people, at the very least, if you did nothing else, do these. So the first exercise, we're going to sit up straight. With an open mouth and a good quality voice, we're going to vocalize an ah, and we're going to hold that for 10 seconds. But the men are going to do it first, while the ladies count 10 seconds. And ladies, you are going to count 10 seconds, counting in twos from 2 to 20. And at the end of that, say stop, or I'll say stop. Okay, everybody knows what they're doing? So sit up straight, open mouth, good quality voice. The men are going to vocalize an ah. The ladies are going to count 10 seconds, counting 2 from 20. Go.
2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 13, 14. Stop.
Stop. All right. So ladies, your turn. So the ladies are going to vocalize an ah with a good quality voice and upright posture. The men are going to count backward from 20 to 2 in 2. So I warn you, ladies, you could be vocalizing for a long time. All right. And everybody knows what they're doing, right? Ladies are going to vocalize, open mouth, good quality voice. Men are counting in twos backward from 20 to 2. Ready, go.
20, 18, 12, 10, 8, 6, 4, 2.
You there yet?
All right, are we there yet? Right, exactly. Okay, now I'm going to keep you unmuted. I'm going to just fly back to my screen for a second, and then we're going to come back again, okay? All right. So that's a core vocal function exercise. That loud, good quality voice, but it always should be with a good quality voice. And remember, it's really our breath support that's driving our voice forward. So that's a warm-up you can do together as a couple. So set a time to practice every day, or choose a time when you're going to do some of this together. This weekend, on Sunday and Monday, I took an 8-hour course, a workshop, in a program called Forte. And it's a voice exercise program, a resistant voice exercise program that was developed for people with voice changes from aging. So age-related voice changes. And the exercises are strengthening exercise. So even if you don't have Parkinson's, but you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s or more, likely at some point you are going to have some age-related voice changes. So these are great exercises even for you to do with your partner. You can do core vocal function exercises. You can do cognitive linguistic exercises. And we're going to do another voice exercise. I'm going to stop sharing here for a minute. And I'm back. All right. So we're going to do a vocal glide, another core exercise. We're going to glide up to a high note and then bring our voice back down to a low note. Now, this is a pitch change. We want to have a loud voice, but it's a pitch change. We're going to a high note to a low note. We're going to do it first just with our bodies quiet, and then we're going to add some arms. Vocal glides are such an important exercise because they stretch the vocal folds, lengthen the vocal folds, shorten the vocal folds. You can think of them like a stretch that you might do with your upper body. So they maintain that mobility and that function not only for voice, but for swallowing, because every time we swallow, our larynx moves up, the vocal folds close to protect our airway, and then we let the air out. All right, so sit up straight. We're going to use that ah. We're going to glide up to a high pitch and then bring it back down. Nice smooth voice. Ready? Go. I saw a few mouths that were barely open. You don't want me to call my name out, do you? So let's do it again before we add our arms. The nice thing about Zoom is you can see yourself. So make sure your mouth is open. This is the auditorium where your voice resonates. So open mouth, upright posture. Here we go again. Ready? It's that was better. All right, we're going to do another one. Now this time, our arms are going to come up shoulder level, and you don't need to come any higher than your shoulders. And then as you glide down, you'll lower your arms. Up as we glide up, and then lower as we come down. Here we go. Your mouth is still open because that's where the sound resonates, right? Okay, we're going to do it again. This time, your right arm is going to come up over your head. And I like to watch my hand going up because it helps me stretch the muscles all the way down the trunk of my body. So your arm is going to come up over your head for a side stretch as you glide up, and then lower your arm, follow it with your eyes as you glide down. Ready? Here we go. Arms opposite arm, and if you can only go shoulder level, because your shoulders bother you, that's perfectly fine. You do everything to the extent your body will allow you. Ready? Here we go. Great. We're going to do one more. This time our hands are crossed. Our arms are going to come up over our head or as high as you can comfortably go as you glide up. And then as you lower your arms, you lower your pitch. Try to go to the highest note you can and the lowest note you can. Ready? Here we go. If you have some water or whatever it is you like to drink, water, take a sip. All right. I just have a couple more slides. I'm going to pop back there for a minute and back to you, so don't mute yourselves yet. All right. So, communication, which we're talking about today, is more than just speaking, isn't it? It's about listening. So maybe some bigger ears would help. I don't know. You can try that. But important to recognize that it's really both.
Mickey Mouse ears.
So, what are some other problems that might interfere with communication? Word finding. That's a really big problem that people report to me a lot. I just can't think of the word. Be associated with brevity, slowness in thinking. And it doesn't mean you're thinking bad, but you're processing information slower. And it's taking you a longer time to retrieve the words you want and to formulate that thought that you want. And conversation is very fast, right? Conversation is fast, it moves back and forth, even just with two people. But with 3 or 4 people, it's even faster. And people interrupt, and people digress, and people change the topics and start talking about something different. And so while you're processing slower, thinking slower about what you want to say, by the time you interject something into the conversation, if your voice wasn't loud enough, guess what? Someone's going to say, sorry, I didn't hear you. What did you say? And you're going to say, I don't know, what did I say? So you lost the train of thought. So again, it may take the person with Parkinson a longer time to process what's being said, a longer time to find the words, to formulate the thought, and a harder time saying it loud enough to be heard.
Get all these people to go back to work.
Component of this.
Here and 2 of them just left.
I'm gonna stop here for a minute. Let's maybe want to mute. Unmute in a bit.
Because somebody came and tell them.
Not sure who's talking, who we need to mute.
Yeah, who's got the background on? You want to mute everybody for now and have them unmute again?
Yeah. Where do I do that?
It should be towards the bottom. Participants, mute all is what you're looking for. If you click open up the participant screen, it should be a mute all. Otherwise, I can reclaim the host. Well. Okay, I think everybody's muted. Sorry about that. Yeah, okay. Just so that it's not interfering for people. Yeah.
Okay. So again, bradyphenia, a little bit slower in thinking, longer time to process information, a little harder time to formulate thoughts and saying it loud enough to be heard. And by the way, that person who was coughing away there, we need to do the next meeting on swallowing, and then I'll show you some exercises there. And so again, if I had to characterize in a very simple way, what is the biggest issue with Parkinson's? It's that as the dopamine is being diminished, your natural dopamine, the automaticity of movement, of speech, of thought formulation. So meaning the way that you did things all your life automatically, you didn't have to think about. You can still do, but you got to think about it now. You got to think about how you move. You have to think about your voice volume. Everything takes effort and focus and attention. I often think, and I say this maybe more to the spouses, because if you've got PD, I'm preaching to the choir. But I think about a time when I've been driving. Here in Florida, in the summertime, we have afternoon thunderstorms, and they're horrible torrential rains. You drive through them, or you barely drive through them, and then they stop. But while you're driving through them, you're gripping the wheel. You turn the radio off because you're so busy focusing. You're looking through the rearview mirror. You're focusing so hard. You're just getting through that storm. Imagine if you had to drive, every time you drove, it was with that intensity of focus. How exhausting that would be. Is there any wonder fatigue is such a common symptom in Parkinson's? Because everything takes a pretty high level of effort and focus and attention. And so if you're a spouse listening today, I think it's just really important to try to stay mindful of that. They're not doing it on purpose. It's really difficult. And I've already mentioned the hearing loss, so how many more times can I say that? But a hearing loss, a diagnosis of dementia or mild cognitive impairment, any of those on their own and in concert with one another are just going to make communication even that more difficult. So we're going to do a little cognitive test, and I'm going to stop sharing here. You can unmute. Oh, unmute. Patrick, did you mute everybody before? Okay, so everybody can unmute themselves again.
Yeah, I did not mute everybody. I don't know. I think we just subsided now.
So you can unmute yourselves. We're going to do a little cognitive linguistic activity. So I will just say again to the non-Parkinson's folks who are tuned in today, who've joined us, you know, there's a reason AARP has brain games on their website. If you're an AARP member and you didn't know that, check them out. There's a reason Brain HQ app is marketed to older, healthy adults, because all of us, Patrick aside, I think he's the youngster in the group, potentially as we age can have changes in cognition, right? Particularly once you stop working. Think about when you were working, before you even got out of the shower in the morning, you were thinking about what you had to do, who you had to call, who was on your schedule. You were doing all of that multitasking already. And then you quit working, and what's the main thing you are focused on? What doctor do I have today? What doctor do I have to go on Wednesday? Even if you do not have Parkinson's and you're a spouse, you can benefit from doing some cognitive linguistic exercises, and that can be a really fun thing to do together. All right, my idea of fun anyways. All right, so you ready? Who does Wordle here? Anybody do Wordle? I'm kind of hooked on Wordle. After dinner every night, I go sit on the lanai and I do my Wordle for the day. All right, so I'm going to call, the first person I call on is going to spell a word. Now, if you are muted still because you're not brave enough to participate. The next person I call on, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'll figure it out when I get there. So just be paying attention. Remember listening. All right, so pay attention. I move fast. All right, Paul, spell the word male.
Male, M-A-I-L.
And be nice and loud, okay? Because on Zoom, everybody's on different devices. Do it one more time. Slow, every word, loud and slow and clear.
M-A-I-L.
All right, George, spell male a different way.
M-A-L-E.
All right, Sue, give me a word that rhymes with male.
Tail.
Spell it.
S-A-I-L.
L. Spell sail backward.
E-L-I-A-S.
Sue, spell it forward.
S-A-I-L. Sail.
Sail.
S-A-L-E. Sorry.
Well, that's the other sail. Yeah, and spell S-A-I-L backward.
L-I-A-S.
Oh, she has a great strong voice. Shirley, Use sale, S-A-L-E, and sale, S-A-I-L, in the same sentence.
I want to sell. No, oh, wait a minute. I want
Sale. That's a southern sale.
my sailboat.
Okay. Michael Schreiner.
It's Ken, actually.
Oh, Ken. Oh, Michelle. It's Michelle. Okay, Ken. Spell the word Ken, scent.
C-E-N-T.
Do it one more time, loud and slow and clear, every letter.
C-E-N-T.
Good. Jim, give me another spelling of the word scent.
S-E-N-T.
Jim,
S-E-N-T.
do it again, loud and slow.
S-E-N-T.
All right, so we heard S-E-N-T. What was yours, Ken?
C-E-N-T.
And Rosemary, give me another spelling of the word scent.
S-C-E-N-T.
You women are smart and sharp today. George.
Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm working smart.
S-C-E-N-T in a sentence.
It is sometimes hard for me to smell the scent of a flower.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going back to my screen, and we just have a few more slides, and then I'll finish up. So you might want to mute yourselves again, just in case someone's phone rings or have some other noise in the background. And by the way, I mentioned I do a weekly speech class, and I've been doing it for almost 6 years now. And not long ago, and I have about 20 members, faithful, I asked, this is your group. I want to make sure I'm working on things that everybody wants to be working on. Give me some feedback. Without exception, everyone said the cognitive is what they liked the most. Now, of course, we're always using our voices and we're communicating, but everybody felt that that was the most beneficial to do some of that cognitive linguistic activity. And I move just as fast as I'm moving here. So you always got to be listening as well as being ready to speak. All right, back to my slides. Just a few more. Oops. Where did my mouse go? Okay, some of you may have seen this little illustration before. It's actually was done by a guy with Parkinson's. And so it's really in a humorous way illustrating another kind of important symptom of Parkinson's, and that's hypo. There's that low prefix again. Remember, hypophonia is low volume. This is hypomania, low expression, absence of facial expression. In fact, it's probably, along with how you're moving, the primary motor symptom that your physician notices, your neurologist, the first time they diagnose you with Parkinson's. It's that much of a hallmark symptom that people have less expression, maybe more of a staring. So why is that even important? Because communication development begins in infancy, begins with eye contact, reciprocal gaze with our parents or other significant people in our environment. It begins with gestures. A baby begins to point to the bottle and then add their voice, ba, 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 ba. And it's the first realization that, coupling these two things actually gets me something. Communication is beginning to emerge. And facial expression. You ask any teenager if they know just by walking in the house and their parent not uttering a word, if they can tell if their parent is what mood they're in, right? Because we convey it through our facial expression. So some of those communicative pre-linguistic behaviors, gestures, eye gaze, facial expression, they get laid down in infancy. They don't go away. They remain a part of our nonverbal communication throughout our lifetime. And they're important, right? You know when you're talking to somebody, if they keep averting their gaze, if you're a wife, you might say, "Who are you looking at? What woman are you looking at? Right? What car are you looking at?" Are you bored? Why aren't you looking at me? So that reciprocal eye gaze is really important. If again, your spouse says to you, do you want to go to the party Saturday night? And you respond, I think I do. It sounds like it might be fun. You don't look like it's going to be very much fun, right? So just like our inflection, prosody, all that inflectional rise and change in our voices convey a message, our facial expression does as well. In fact, there's been a few interesting published studies where they actually had found that nurses and doctors actually identified patients as being depressed, patients with Parkinson's, that weren't, but they misinterpreted their emotional expression because of their facial expression. So when I'm doing a class, particularly my voice aerobics class, I'm always emphasizing exaggerating facial movements. Those muscles are getting stiff and then yield that hypolomania. So this is a pretty busy slide, and it's really in a way almost a summary of the things that can affect you as someone with Parkinson's when you begin to experience changes in the way you communicate. Those changes can be in voice, clarity. They can be changes in language, how you're processing or formulating language, or cognitive, because how we make sense of our world is through our language. So you can't really separate thinking and speaking. Changes in facial expression or body language. You may not even move and gesture the same way you did because of maybe motor stiffness or a tremor. And even those changes up to that point can begin to alter your self-image. You know, again, as we age, as I age, it's daunting enough sometimes when you see yourself in the mirror, and I don't look like I did in that video in 2008. So we have age changes to our bodies and our how we are functioning. But if you have Parkinson's, it can really also alter your own experience of your self-image. We've talked about fatigue and how that can be variable. I often say Parkinson's symptoms are like curly hair. You never know from within a day how it's going to be, and you never know from day to day. But fatigue, general fatigue, is going to also affect how you're using your voice, how you're swallowing, how you're interacting and communicating. And all of those changes for you as someone with Parkinson's are indirectly and directly affecting those primary communication partners, usually a spouse, but maybe other family members who you interact with a lot. So I'm almost done, and I always put this quote. Let me move myself out of here. I always put this quote at the end of my presentations because I think it's so important. Variability is the law of life, and no two faces are the same, no two bodies are alike, and no two individuals react alike or behave alike under the abnormal conditions which we know as disease.
Hang on. Hey, Al, put yourself on mute, please.
Oh,
So we can hear you. Can you start that again, Mary? Al was talking.
So I know that you can all read that, and I don't need to read it out loud, but I think, again, it's a really important statement. I could put 100 more people in this group with us, and the only variable that you all would have in common would be a diagnosis of Parkinson's, right? Some similar symptoms that allowed the neurologist to make that diagnosis. But beyond that, we are all a heterogeneous group of people. We're all different. How you respond to your medications is different. How you function in your life is different. How you function within your marriage and your families is different from anybody else in this meeting. So when I'm seeing you as a therapist, it's important that I recognize that I've got to design an intervention that really is individualized to you, to who you are, to what your communicative needs are. And in doing that, I've got to bring your spouse into some of our visits too, right? You know, early on when I began to, early on, as far back as 1997, when I was first doing the LSVT, I used to not invite a spouse into the treatment room. And my feeling was, if you're the person with Parkinson's, you're the person with the voice problem, you got to own it. It's your problem. You got to work on it. But I've gotten a little smarter, maybe, or maybe I've just learned something over time. And I realized that I can't leave your significant other or primary communication partners out of what we're doing, because not only do they have to understand how they can help you at home, but they have to also, I see how you interact. And sometimes I'm picking on the spouse. I'm really saying to them, all right, you need to do the 10-second rule. Stop talking. Give your partner 10 seconds to think of the word they want to use. How can you help? Not always by filling in the words. And that might be how you've communicated all your marriage, because husbands and wives do that, right? They fill in each other's words. They say they kind of know what they're thinking. But sometimes that's not what you need if you've got PD. You need your partner to wait 10 seconds, or maybe you need them just to kind of get you back on topic. You know, honey, remember I asked you, what did you do yesterday when you went to the exercise group? Oh yeah, that's what we were talking about. Just got them back on topic, helped them reorganize and get that thought again. So, in conclusion, I told you I would conclude soon. Communication difficulties are complex, right? Just like everything with Parkinson's. But preserving your ability to communicate, in my opinion, what could be more important? I can tell you that what has kept my passion and my interest in what I do for 40 years now is because I believe to the deepest part of my soul that there's nothing more important than being able to communicate. I have stood at the bedside of patients in ICU and restored communication for the first time when they didn't talk for weeks and saw the power of that. I have stood at the bedside with patients in ICU who were near the end of life and helped them find a way to communicate in those days. So nothing is more important, and nothing more than how we communicate connects us with those people we love. And you don't want to let that go. So I'm going to stop at this point. I'm going to stop sharing. Actually, I'll end with this slide. So I will invite you to visit my website if you've never been there. Most importantly, visit my blog. So I write not a couple times a month, maybe. You can join my newsletter if you want to get those. In my blog, I try to write about things that are based on what I do every day of the week, working with people, what I'm learning, what I've learned, what I think can be helpful, what I think maybe you need to be paying attention to, or you can discuss with your partner at home. And so I'm going to stop sharing at this point, come back to all of you. And I am happy to take any questions. I know it's getting a little bit late, but or comments, if anything you'd like to share.
Mary, this has been so awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Let's toss it out to the group here. Okay, Barbara, go ahead. BJ.
She talked about having it slower to get the answer. It's maybe slower to speak and get it out. Can you give us an example of something we can do to help with the processing part? That sometimes takes longer with Parkinson's.
Yep. So I think probably the main thing you could do, one would be to reduce distractions in the environment, because believe it or not, when we're listening, paying attention, we're using some of our executive function to attend to the message, but we are also using some of our brain to disattend, not pay attention to the lawnmower outside, to Fox News that's on in the background and all the other environmental sounds. So first thing I would do would be to minimize some of that background distraction so that the person really is able to attend and process. And I think the other thing you can do is just kind of help with topic maintenance. So one of the aspects of communication we call kind of a pragmatic aspect of communication is for you and I to have a conversation, for Patrick and I to have a conversation. First of all, we have to establish a topic. You've got to know what I'm talking about. and we've got to stay on topic. And so if you're talking and your partner's having a hard time sort of jumping in, or you might just want to help get them back on topic. Honey, remember we were talking about this, or this is what I asked you, or this is what I was saying. So you sort of help reintroduce them back into the conversation. That I think can be helpful. And for you, the person with PD, I think what's important, again, you do have to own it, right? It's your problem. You've got to let listeners know what you need. I always say to my patients, I say this to my loud crowd group all the time, don't think for a minute your friends are going to tell you, ask you to repeat. They may ask you to repeat, but they're not going to say anything. They were going to talk behind your back. They'll get in the car and say, oh, poor George, his Parkinson's, we can hardly hear him anymore. But you can let your listeners know that you're open to feedback. You can let them know at the beginning of a conversation, I'm working on speaking louder. Let me know if you can understand me okay. Let me know if I need to clarify anything. As you're talking, at certain points in the conversation, you might pause and ask again for clarity from the people you're speaking with. Are you following me? How do we know if somebody's paying attention? Well, Paul's looking at the screen. I'm assuming he's looking at me and listening. If Paul were doing this, I'd say he's tuned out, right? So remember that eye contact. It begins in infancy. And it's not staring at somebody. That's creepy. But it's called reciprocal eye gaze. We're always attending to our listener through our visual gaze. And if for too long, I'm looking over here again, what is it signaling? I don't have to say anything. It's signaling.
And I can't hear you
Right?
if you're in a way.
I hate when people, nowadays, what do people do when you're talking? They're looking at their cell phone. What could be ruder or more disengaging from a conversation than to divert your eye, not only divert your eye gaze, but now you're not even paying attention. You're into something else. So those things which are nonverbal aspects of communication, you got to pay attention to, not only because you might have PD, but your partners have to pay attention to it as well. Okay. Any other? Sorry, Barb, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent, but that happens.
Anybody else?
Any
Other questions before we close things up or comments?
I'd like to share that you've learned in. I want to say one other thing. So again, I showed you that there was a picture early on of a couple, and I said Mike's been a patient of mine. I really consider him a friend because now I feel he and Pat are friends, and they're just a wonderful couple in my view. They're like the model of how I'd want to be married. And I didn't necessarily have a great model. Some of us haven't had great models from our parents of what a healthy marriage looked like, what a healthy relationship looked like. And if you happen to maybe not have had that model, or you don't necessarily, if you think you could do a little work in that area, pay attention into your support groups or in your classes of couples that you meet that seem to have it. They seem to communicate well. They seem to work. Pat and Mike lived on a sailboat for 10 years. I'd say if you're living on a boat for 10 years, you got good communication, right? So they would be a great couple to hang out with. Learn from them. They're a model for you. See how they're interacting. Ask them, how are you managing this? Because I think they are going to manage Parkinson's exactly the way they've managed the rest of their life. They're going to navigate those waters just like they navigated on their sailboat together. So hook up with some people that you view as having healthy relationships and, learn together about how you're going to navigate this chronic disease that's sort of entered in. All right. So I didn't mean to keep you all over, but.
That's okay. This was, as I'm sitting here listening to this, one of the things that I've kind of come upon realizing is that Parkinson's, and I use this all the time, makes things that we learn to do without being taught difficult. And like walking, physical thing, getting out of a chair, getting in a chair. So we got to break these down, and communication that goes right along with it. and what you shared with us today, I think really shifts the way we think, fills in gaps in terms of communication. And it was just, I thought it was fabulous. And I would like everyone to give a round of applause to Mary. This was one of these presentations that definitely did not disappoint. I've been looking forward to introducing you to my group.
Thanks,
And yeah, absolutely. So I'll just ask.
me and Patrick doing a class together. I think that would be good. We need a push. We've been talking about it for a long time. So you can give him feedback.
I think it'd
We
be
go
good.
ahead and we'll definitely do it. In fact, maybe let's you and I talk about what it would look like, and let's plan to bring it here. And we'll do it here, and for your folks as well, if you like. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thank you again so much, Mary, for your time. And thank you, everybody, for participating. Thanks, George. Thanks, Sue. Thank you all. Some of you are new, and I haven't met you before. I look forward to meeting you. We meet every Wednesday. We sometimes just have free-flowing discussion. Sometimes we have topics presenters like today. So make sure I have your email. If you're here, I must. But anyway. All right. Thanks, everyone, for your participation, and we'll see you next time.